The snow came sideways on cold as rock. It always did. The planet had no soft seasons, no gentle rain, no warm spring mornings that made a man feel glad to be alive. It had ice, wind, and iron ore buried deep beneath its frozen crust, and that was exactly why the colony was there. The ore was good, the ground was hard, the people who stayed were harder. Aldrich Voss had stayed. He had come 11 years ago as a colonial engineer, part of the first wave meant to build the settlement's infrastructure. Most of that wave had left when the contracts ended. Aldrich had looked at the half-finished forge on the edge of town, the broken equipment sitting in the snow, and the colonists who needed tools and parts they couldn't afford to ship from the inner systems, and he had decided to stay. He bought the forge for almost nothing. He learned metalwork properly, not the way engineers learned it, but the way craftsmen did, slowly, painfully, with burned hands and ruined pieces, and long nights figuring out what he had done wrong. Now the forge was good. Now people came from 3 settlements away to have Aldrich fix things that no one else could fix. Tonight the storm had driven everyone inside. The town was quiet except for the wind. Aldrich was working late on an ore hauler chassis that had cracked along a load-bearing seam, sloppy factory work from some manufacturer who had never actually driven one of these things across frozen ground. He had the piece clamped in the vise and was working the heat into it slowly, the way you had to, letting the metal breathe instead of forcing it. He heard the thunder at the 18th hour. Except it wasn't thunder. Thunder rolled. This sound was sharp, a single crack that shook the forge windows, followed by a deep concussive boom that he felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. He set down his tools. He went to the door and opened it and looked out into the blowing dark. 50 meters away, something steamed in the snow. He stood there for a moment, looking at it. A crater, maybe 2 meters wide, with something at the center that glowed faint orange and was rapidly losing heat. Not a meteorite. Meteorites didn't have edges that sharp, didn't have pieces that looked, even from here, like they had been manufactured. He walked toward it. What he found when he got close enough to see through the blowing snow was something he had no name for. The object was wreckage, that much was clear. A small pod of some kind, cracked open along one side like an egg that had been dropped. Pieces of the hull were scattered around it, and at the center of the wreckage, tangled in something that might have been a restraint harness, was a creature. Aldrich crouched down. The creature was the size of a large dog, but shaped nothing like one. It had scales, dark green-black, like old iron, and 4 limbs that ended in claws. There was a tail. There were 2 structures on its back that might have been wings, one of which bent at an angle that wings were not supposed to bend. The face was long and tapered, with 2 nostrils that flared even in sleep, and a jaw that was slightly open, showing the tips of very small, very sharp teeth. It was breathing. Barely, but it was breathing. Aldrich put his hand near its face and felt the faint warmth of breath against his palm. He put his hand on its side and felt the small, fast beat of a heart working too hard. He did not spend time wondering what it was. He did not stand there in the snow calculating whether touching it was safe or smart or wise. He thought about only one thing: it was cold, and it was hurt, and it would not survive the night out here. He unclipped the restraint harness with some difficulty. The mechanism was strange to him, but mechanisms were what he understood, and he figured it out. He picked the creature up. It weighed less than he expected. He carried it back to the forge. Inside, he stoked the fire to full. The forge could run hot enough to make a man sweat in his shirt in the middle of a cold-as-rock winter, and he pushed it to that now. He cleared the workbench closest to the heat and laid the creature down. He pulled every insulation blanket he kept in the forge for cold-weather work and layered them carefully, making sure not to press against the bent wing. The wing concerned him. He had set broken bones before, animal bones, on the frontier when there was no vet and the animal would suffer otherwise. He had set a cracked arm for a colonist once when the medical transport was 3 days out. He understood the basic principle: find the right position, stabilize it, hold it there until it can heal. He cut 2 thin pieces of flat steel from his scrap pile. He padded them with wrapped cloth. Working very gently, moving slowly so as not to jostle the creature, he found the break in the wing structure, There was a place where two rigid sections met and should not have bent the way they had, and he guided them back into alignment. He bound the makeshift splint in place with careful wraps of soft copper wire, not tight enough to cut, tight enough to hold. The creature made a sound when he did this, not a scream, more like a sharp exhale, a small noise of pain, and then silence. It did not wake. Aldrich sat back on his stool. He looked at the strange, small thing on his workbench, tucked in blankets, warmed by the forge, its strange face still, and its chest moving in the small, steady rhythm of sleep. He had no idea what it was. He had no way to contact anyone tonight. The storm had knocked out the long-range communicators, which happened regularly and was one of the many things he had on his list to properly fix. He had no medical knowledge that applied here, no reference, no guide. What he had was a warm forge, some food, and the understanding that a living thing was hurt and cold and needed help. That was enough to start with. He found the emergency ration kit from one of the haulers in his repair bay. It contained, among other things, raw compressed mineral blocks meant to supplement a worker's diet in environments where food was scarce, iron-heavy, dense, mostly tasteless. He had never eaten one willingly. He broke a small piece off and set it near the creature's mouth, not forcing it, just placing it where it could be found if the creature woke hungry. He rebuilt the fire twice through the night. Around the 4th hour after he brought it in, the creature's eyes opened. They were gold, very bright gold, like metal that had just come out of the fire. They moved slowly at first, then faster, taking in the ceiling, the walls, the glow of the forge, the tools hanging on their hooks, the smell of coal and iron and hot metal. Then they found Aldrich, sitting on his stool 3 feet away, with a cup of cold coffee he had forgotten to drink. The creature went very still. Aldrich raised one hand, slowly, palm outward. He had no idea if the gesture meant anything to it. It was just the most open, least threatening thing he could think to do. He said quietly, "You're all right, you're inside, it's warm." The gold eyes watched him. He could see fear in them, or something that worked the way fear worked. The creature was calculating whether to run, whether he was a threat, whether the warmth was worth the uncertainty. He put his hand back in his lap. He picked up the cold coffee and drank some of it, normal, calm, not a threat. "You hungry?" he said. He nodded toward the mineral block he had placed nearby. The creature's nostrils moved. It looked at the block. Something in its expression shifted. It reached out one small clawed hand, still watching him, and took the mineral block and ate it. They sat in silence for a while after that. The forge crackled. The storm pushed at the walls. The creature was wrapped in blankets, watching Aldrich, and Aldrich drank his cold coffee and let it look at him for as long as it needed to. Eventually, in a voice that was rough and small and formed human words with a kind of difficulty that suggested it was working hard at something unfamiliar, it asked, "Why?" Aldrich looked up. "Why did you help me?" it said. He thought about that for a moment, not because the answer was complicated, because he wanted to say it right. "You were cold and broken," he said. "That was enough." The gold eyes watched him. He could not read whatever passed through them then. Whatever that creature felt in that moment, gratitude, confusion, something without a human name, it stayed behind those gold eyes, held close. It slept again before morning. Aldrich covered it more carefully and went back to work on the ore hauler chassis, because the colonist who owned it needed it back by next week, and because having something to do with his hands while an impossible creature slept on his workbench helped him feel like the world was still a normal size. 6 days passed. The creature healed faster than he expected. By the 3rd day, it was moving around the forge, carefully, looking at everything with those bright gold eyes. It watched him work with the kind of focused attention that made him feel observed in a way he wasn't used to. It ate the mineral blocks steadily. Its wing, in the splint, seemed to cause it less pain each day. It did not tell him its name. He did not ask. He called it nothing, just talked to it the way he talked to himself when he was working, narrating what he was doing and why. On the 6th morning, a ship appeared in the sky. It did not look like any human ship Aldrich had ever seen. It was large and dark and moved with a kind of unhurried confidence that said it did not worry about who saw it. It landed in the flat ground outside the town, at a distance that was polite enough not to frighten the colonists, but close enough to be clear about its purpose. The creature in the forge went very still when it heard the landing. Then it moved toward the door. It stopped before it left. It turned and looked at Aldrich. He stood at his workbench. He raised his hand again, the same open palm gesture as the first night. The creature looked at him for a long time. Then it made a sound, low, very soft, that he had no way to interpret. It might have been a word in a language he didn't know. It might have been something that had no translation at all. Then it went out into the morning. He watched from the forge doorway. A ramp had descended from the dark ship. Two large figures, much larger than the creature, same scaled look, same kind of movement, came down it. They crossed to the small figure standing in the snow. There was an exchange. The large figures barely glanced at the forge, at Aldrich, at any of it. They escorted the small creature up the ramp. At the top, before the ramp closed, the small figure turned one more time. The gold eyes found him across the distance. Then the ramp closed, and the ship rose, and Aldrich stood in his doorway watching it go until it was just a point of dark against the pale sky, and then nothing at all. He went back inside. He went back to work on the hauler chassis. He never mentioned what had happened to anyone, not because he was hiding it, just because he was not sure how to explain it, and the hauler needed to be finished, and the colony needed it, and there was always more work to do. On the wall of the Dragon Kingdom's Hall of Memory, 3 weeks later, in script carved into stone that would stand for 10,000 years, a new line appeared. The archivists who added it were precise and careful, as they always were. They recorded the name, the species, the occupation, the location, and the date. They added, at the end, one note unusual, but approved by the elder who had requested the entry. The note said, "He asked nothing." They did not know yet what that would mean. They could not see ahead 10 years, or 50, or 300. They were just archivists doing their work, recording what had been given to them to record. But the stone was good stone, and the script was deep. And Calder's rock, on that day, was very cold, and the forge on its edge was very warm. There is a kind of memory that does not fade. Most memories are like marks in sand, clear at first, softened by the next tide, gone by the one after that. Even the ones people think they will never forget grow dim with time. The sharp edges round off. The colors go flat. What was once a feeling becomes a story, and what was once a story becomes just a few words that stand in for something that no longer fully exists. But there is another kind of memory, the kind that burns itself into you not because of its size or its drama, but because of what it said about the world. A moment so simple and so unexpected that every time you return to it, years later, decades later, centuries later, it is still exactly as clear as the first time, still warm. For Ryveth, that memory was a forge on a cold planet, and a human with soot on his hands, and 3 words said quietly in the dark. You were cold, you were broken, that was enough. She had been carrying those words for 240 years, when the Galactic Accord began its quiet proceedings against humanity. She was an elder now, not the oldest. The Dragon Kingdom had elders who remembered things Ryveth could only read about, but old enough that young dragons came to her for teaching, and she had enough years behind her that she understood something important. Most of what was called wisdom was just the slow accumulation of noticing. Noticing what was true, even when it was inconvenient. Noticing what mattered, even when everyone else had moved on. She taught in the great hall on Vindara, where the ceiling was so high that the upper vaults were always in soft shadow, and the floor was polished black stone that reflected the light like still water. She taught history and culture, and the deep laws that held dragon civilization together across generations. The laws about debt and memory and obligation, which were not just customs, but bones, the things that kept the whole structure of their society standing. Every cycle, in the first lesson she gave to new students, she told a story. It was always the same story. A small pod crashing on a cold frontier world. A human she had never expected to see again. An act of help given without hesitation, without reason, without any calculation of gain. The students listened politely. Some of them found it interesting. A few of them asked questions. Most of them moved on. Ryvath did not move on. She never had. She watched humanity the way you watch something that you believe in before anyone else does. From a distance, for a long time, through official records and trade reports and the occasional fragment of communication that made its way through the Accord's information networks. Humans were loud. They were everywhere at once. They fought each other with a passion that alarmed their neighbors and then forgave each other with an ease that confused them. They built things quickly and sometimes carelessly, and then spent enormous energy fixing what they had gotten wrong. They were, by the standards of the elder races, extremely young, and they moved through the galaxy with the energy of something that did not know yet how much it had to learn. The elder races found this exhausting. The Accord found it threatening. The first real sign of what was coming arrived in a document, a 112-page analysis prepared by Voice Warden Ulrich of the Serethi, who was very smart and very precise, and who had spent 40 years compiling data on human expansion. Ryvath received a copy through the standard diplomatic channels, because the Dragon Kingdom held observer status in the Accord and received all materials distributed to its members. She read it in one sitting. Ulrich was not wrong in the narrow sense. The numbers he presented were accurate. Humans had colonized, in the past 2 centuries, a number of star systems that no other species had managed in twice the time. Their population growth was extraordinary. Their weapons technology was advancing at a pace that made the Serethi analysts nervous. They had 3 times in the past century settled worlds that the Accord had designated for protected species. Not aggressively, not after consultation, simply because they had found the world, determined it was viable, and moved in. They were not malicious. That was almost worse from the Accord's perspective. Malicious intent could be addressed. This was just momentum, a species that had not yet learned to slow down and ask whether a thing should be done before doing it. Ulrich's proposal was contained in the final 12 pages. The Human Containment Protocol. It used careful language, words like stabilization and managed development and protective framework, but what it meant was this: the Accord would place humanity in a box, restrict their FTL capability, limit their colonization, manage their growth from the outside rather than allow them to continue unchecked. Ryvath set the document down. She sat for a long time in her teaching hall, where the ceiling was high and the floor was polished like still water. She thought about a forge, about a small body carried in from the snow, about a hand raised in a gesture of peace by a man who had no reason to offer peace, no understanding of what she was, no guarantee that she wouldn't hurt him. Then she went to see her grandmother. Grand Matriarch Sorvin was old in a way that Ryvath was not yet, old in the way that mountains were old, not crumbling, but settled, deeply rooted, impossible to move by anything less than a catastrophic force. She received Ryvath in the smaller of her 2 audiences' chambers, which was itself larger than most buildings on Calder's Rock. She was reviewing records when Ryvath arrived, and she finished what she was doing before she looked up, because Sorvin had never in her life let urgency from someone else set her pace. "You've read it," Sorvin said. "Yes, and..." Ryvath sat across from her grandmother and chose her words carefully, because Sorvin had no patience for imprecision. Ulrich is building a case that sounds like prudence, but is actually fear. He has convinced 4 species to support a proposal that will permanently limit a civilization's growth based on what they might do rather than what they have done. "That is an accurate reading," Sorvin agreed. "What do you want me to do?" "Oppose it." Sorvin was quiet for a moment. "The kingdom does not involve itself in Accord politics. You know this. We hold observer status by choice. Neutrality is not a courtesy. It is a policy maintained over 800 years that has kept our relationship with the Accord functional. This is different. It is always different when someone wants the kingdom to break its policy. Riveth kept her voice steady. We carry a debt, grandmother, to them. There it was, the thing she had come to say. She felt the weight of it, not the weight of the words themselves, but the weight of the law behind them. The right of remembered debt was not a custom. It was inscribed in the foundational texts of dragon civilization, older than the kingdom's current form, older than their spacefaring age. A debt acknowledged and held was not merely a memory, it was an obligation. Sorvain's expression did not change. One human acted with kindness toward you, one man, on one world 300 years ago. That is not a debt to a civilization, it is a debt to an individual. He was human, Riveth said. His debt is their inheritance. That is an interpretation. It is the correct one. Silence sat between them. Sorvain looked at her granddaughter for a long time. She was calculating, Riveth could feel it, not whether Riveth was right or wrong about the law, but whether the moment had come, whether the debt was real, whether one man's act of ordinary goodness 240 years ago on a frozen frontier world was enough to carry the weight that Riveth wanted to place on it. You have watched them, Sorvain said. All these years, what have you seen? Riveth considered how to answer. I have seen a species that makes terrible decisions very loudly and then works very hard to correct them. I have seen them extend help to those who hated them. I have seen them give their own resources to those who had none. I have seen them do this without calculation, without expectation of return, in ways that cost them something real. She paused. I have seen them be, at their best, what Aldrich Voss was on the night I landed in the snow on Calder's Rock. At their best, Sorvain said, not always. No, not always, but often enough that it is a pattern and not a coincidence. Sorvain was quiet again. The audience chamber was very still. I will not move the kingdom against the Accord, she said at last. Not yet. The protocol is not yet finalized. The vote has not been called. She looked at Riveth steadily. But I will grant you one thing. You may send an observer to human space, quietly without official status. Let them look. Let them document what they find. A pause. If what they bring back confirms what you believe, we will speak again. Riveth accepted this. It was not what she had asked for. It was what was possible, and she understood the difference. She had one more question. Who should I send? Sorvain looked at her with something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was close. That is obvious, is it not? Send someone who already believes your story might be true, someone who grew up hearing it. Riveth understood. She sent her son. Bryn had been born into a family where the story of Calder's Rock was told the way other families told creation myths, not as legend, but as the first fact, the thing that all other things arranged themselves around. He had grown up knowing the name Aldrich Voss before he knew the names of most political leaders. He had asked when he was very young whether humans were good, and Riveth had told him the truth, that she didn't know about humans in general, but that one human had been good, and that one was enough to make her want to understand the rest. He was an adult now, young by dragon reckoning, barely 2 centuries old, and he had the quality Riveth most needed. He could watch without judgment and report without bias. He was not a believer yet. He was open. She gave him a disguise, the thermal suits that allowed dragons to compress their heat signature, the light-bending field that blurred the more distinctive features of their form. Not perfect, but enough for a frontier world or a transit station. She gave him recording equipment. She gave him as much money as he could spend without drawing attention. She gave him, last of all, a small card with 2 words on it, written in human script, because she wanted him to see them the way a human would see them. It said, be honest. He left on a quiet morning, when the mist was still low on Vindara, and the great city was not yet fully awake. Riveth watched his ship go until it was gone. Then she went back to her teaching hall, and the high-shadowed ceiling, and the lesson she had given 240 years without the ending she was still waiting for. She could wait more. That was the thing about the kind of memory that didn't fade. It made the waiting possible. Every morning she returned to a forge and a warmth and a voice saying something true, and that morning was as clear as the first time, and it gave her another day. She taught her students. She watched the Accord's proceedings carefully from a distance. She waited for her son to come home. The first thing Bryn noticed about humans was that they were always in motion. Not the restless, anxious kind of motion, though there was some of that too, but the purposeful, constant, rolling motion of a species that had decided, somewhere in its deep history, that stopping was not an option. Even in the transit stations, where most species sat and waited with the patient stillness of those accustomed to long journeys across empty space, humans walked. They talked. They rearranged their belongings. They struck up conversations with strangers. They fixed things that were barely broken yet, because they couldn't stand watching something be slightly wrong without doing something about it. Bryn had been watching them for 6 months before he landed on Calder's Rock, and in those 6 months, he had already filled 2 full record logs. Calder's Rock had changed. He knew the old records. His mother had shown him the survey maps, the early colonial reports, the photographs of the original settlement from over 300 years ago. The forge had been at the edge of a small cluster of buildings at the edge of nothing, surrounded by ice and dark sky. Now the city stretched for 12 kilometers across the flattened plateau, not a large city by human standards, but solid and dense, and clearly built by people who intended to stay. The ore refinery at the eastern edge ran 3 shifts a day. The landing field had 6 bays. There were schools and medical centers, and on the main avenue, a row of shops selling things that people wanted rather than just things they needed, which was, Bryn had come to understand, the human way of indicating that a settlement had stopped being temporary. At the edge of the city, on a small square of preserved ground, there was a museum. He went there on the 3rd day. It was a modest building, a single room really, with clean walls and careful lighting and the careful, slightly reverent quietness of a space where something old was kept. There were photographs on the walls, the earliest ones in black and white, grainy, showing the original settlement under heavy snow. There were tools mounted in glass cases, a hammer, a pair of long tongs, a draw knife, things that were 3 centuries old but had been preserved with care. At the center of the room, on a raised platform, was an anvil. A placard beside it said it was the original forge anvil, recovered from the site when the building had finally been torn down 70 years ago after structural failure. Beside the anvil, a smaller placard said something that Bryn stood and read 3 times. Aldrich Voss, engineer and blacksmith, lived and worked on this site from the colony's 7th year until his death at age 71. He was known for precision work and fair prices, and for the policy he maintained his entire career of never turning away work that was genuinely needed, regardless of whether the person who needed it could pay. The last sentence was followed by a note from the museum's director, which said simply, "He was a good man." Bryn stood in front of the anvil for a long time. He was not given to emotion in any dramatic way. He had his mother's quality of deep feeling held in quiet, but he put one gloved hand on the surface of the anvil and stood there, in the small room on the cold planet, and thought about his mother as a hatchling carried in from the snow by a man who no longer existed. Then he left and went to work because he had a job to do. The next 2 years were the most thorough education of his life. He moved through human space methodically, spending between 3 and 6 weeks in each location before moving on. He visited core worlds and frontier settlements. He spent a month on a deep space station that processed atmospheric data from uninhabitable systems, and found, to his surprise, that the 40-odd people who lived there had built a small garden in the station's center ring, not for food, but because one of them had said it made the place feel less like an outpost and more like home, and everyone else had agreed and helped plant it. He visited a hospital ship that traveled the outer systems and was, he learned, run by a woman who had given up a position at one of the inner system medical academies because she felt the outer settlements needed care more and had moved her entire operation out here 8 years ago. The ship ran on donations and government grants, and the woman's obvious refusal to accept that it couldn't survive. He found in a frontier transit hub a human who ran a free translation service for alien travelers who didn't speak the common trading languages. The man was retired, had learned 7 non-human languages in his old age because he had found it interesting, and had simply decided to sit in the hub 3 days a week and help people who were confused and lost. He asked for nothing. He turned no one away. Bryn recorded all of it. He also recorded the other things because his mother had told him to be honest, and he intended to be. He recorded the dock workers' strike on Calder's Rock that turned briefly violent before it was resolved. He recorded the territory dispute between 2 human colonies over mineral rights that lasted 4 years and damaged both settlements economically. He recorded the waste discharge from a mining operation on the 3rd moon of a gas giant that had damaged a habitat important to a native species. Damage that was thoughtless rather than deliberate, and that the colony had, when confronted with evidence, spent significant resources correcting, but that had been done in the first place through a combination of ignorance and not asking questions. He recorded humans at their worst and at their best, because both were real, and because the full truth was the only thing worth sending home. It was in the 8th month that he met the diplomat. The young man was sitting alone at a table in the common area of a transit hub on the outer edge of the Accord's traffic corridors, surrounded by papers, actual papers, printed, which Bryn had come to understand was something humans did when they were thinking hard about something and needed to spread it out in front of them. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been working very hard for a long time and was not sure it was working. Bryn, who was presenting as a muffled, heavily clothed traveler of indeterminate species, a common enough sight on frontier hubs, sat at the table across from him, not because he had a plan to talk to the man, just because it was the only open seat in a busy common area. The young man looked up, registered Bryn's presence, and went back to his papers. After a few minutes, he looked up again. "Sorry," he said, "are you waiting for this table? I can move." "No," Bryn said. His voice modulator produced a reasonable approximation of a standard trade language accent. "I don't need the space." The young man nodded and went back to his papers. Bryn ordered food. The young man ordered a second coffee without looking up. They sat in companionable silence for a while. It was the young man who spoke first, and not to Bryn, exactly, more to himself or to the papers, the way people talked when they had been alone with a problem for too long and needed to hear it out loud. 7 meetings, he said. 7 meetings and 11 months, and I have not gotten a single formal statement of support from any of them. Bryn said nothing. They all say the same thing, the young man continued, still to himself. Too complicated, too politically sensitive. We understand your concerns, but we appreciate your position, but... He picked up one of the papers and looked at it without reading it. Nobody wants to stand up and say anything before they know who else is standing. "Who are you trying to convince?" Bryn asked. The young man looked at him. Something in his face recalibrated, remembering that he was not alone, that the heavily clothed stranger across from him might have ears or their equivalent. "Anyone," he said, after a pause that made clear he was deciding how much to say. "I work for the Human Diplomatic Service. I've been traveling the Accord systems for almost a year trying to build a case that humanity deserves to be taken seriously rather than managed." "The containment protocol," Bryn said. The young man looked at him differently then. "You know about it." "I hear things." A pause. "It's not public yet, not officially." "No, but it will be." The young man set his paper down. He looked at Bryn the way you looked at something that might be more than it appeared to be. Then he seemed to make a decision and let it go, because he was tired and the common area was public and he had more pressing things to worry about. "My name is Harrow," he said. "I don't have a name you could easily say," Bryn told him. That made Harrow smile a little, which was not what Bryn had expected. "Fair enough." He picked up his coffee. "What do you think, honestly, from someone looking in from the outside?" Bryn considered this for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that the Accord is making its decision about humanity based on what it fears they could become, not on what they are. He paused. And I think that what they are is more complicated and more interesting than the Accord's assessment suggests. Harrow looked at him. That's more generous than most assessments I've heard. Most assessments are made by people who study data. I have been watching. What have you seen? Bryn thought about the garden on the deep space station, the hospital ship, the old man with 7 languages and no reason to share them except that sharing them helped. He thought about the strike that turned violent and the mining accident and the 4-year territorial dispute. He thought about all of it together as one picture. A species that is still becoming what it is, he said, one that makes significant mistakes and then, often, corrects them, one that helps people it has no obligation to help, one that is capable of extraordinary ordinary decency. Harrow was quiet for a moment. Then, you sound like you've seen something specific. Several things specific. Harrow turned his coffee cup in his hands. We're not perfect, we know that. We have a lot of history we're not proud of, we know that too. He looked up. We just want the chance to be better. Bryn looked at him. He thought, very specifically, about his mother saying those same words in different forms across 240 years, telling the story of a forge to students who may or may not have understood why it mattered. He said nothing more. He finished his meal. He paid and stood and nodded at Harrow in the manner of someone taking their leave. Harrow nodded back. He was already looking at his papers again. Bryn left. He went directly to his ship and composed the beginning of his final report. He included everything, the records, the documentation, the full scope of 2 years of watching. He wrote it without editorial comment or argument. He stated what he had seen and let it speak. But at the end, before he closed the file, he added 1 paragraph, not as data, as observation. He wrote, I met today a young human diplomat who is trying to do, in the official language of interstellar politics, what Aldrich Voss did in a forge on Calder's Rock 3 centuries ago, help without certainty of outcome, without guarantee of return, because the need was real and he was present. He will probably fail based on current conditions, but he is trying. He sent the report ahead by tight beam transmission and set course for home. The journey was long. He spent much of it in the way he had learned to spend long journeys since childhood, not counting the hours, but thinking about the story his mother had always told. The small creature in the snow, the open door, the warmth given without question. He had not known, before this journey, whether he believed in that story as a representative thing, whether one man's act said anything true about a whole civilization, or whether his mother was holding onto a memory the way people hold onto the things that comforted them rather than the things that were real. He knew now. He did not know that humanity would be saved by it. He did not know whether his report would change anything, whether his grandmother would move, whether the protocol would pass or fail. He did not know any of the things that would follow. But he knew what he had seen, and he knew what it meant. And when Vindara appeared in his ship's viewport and he began the long descent toward home, he felt something settle in him that had been uncertain for 2 years. His mother met him at the landing bay. She was as she always was, tall, still, watching him with those gold eyes that had not changed in all the time he had known her. She waited until he had come down the ramp before she spoke. Well, she said. He handed her the full report drive. He stood in front of her for a moment, looking at the woman who had spent 240 years carrying a story about a blacksmith and a cold planet and a single act of unremarkable goodness. Mother, he said, they are like him. Her eyes closed, just for a moment. Then they opened again, and she took the drive from his hand, and they walked together out of the landing bay toward the city. She already knew, she had always known, but she needed him to see it for himself, and he had. And now they could begin. There were things in the universe that looked like decisions, but were not. The Galactic Accord had been making these kinds of things for centuries. They dressed them in procedure. They surrounded them with documentation and review periods and committee assessments and formal language about protective frameworks and managed development. They made them look like the careful, reasoned conclusions of wise and experienced minds. But everyone who had spent any time inside the Accords chambers understood what they actually were. Conclusions that had already been reached, dressed up in the clothing of process so they could be called something other than what they were. The Human Containment Protocol was one of these things. Harrow had known it for 8 months before the formal session was called. He had understood it the way you understand weather before it arrives. You could see the shape of it coming, the way the smaller signs arranged themselves into a pattern and what the pattern was pointing toward. He had spent those 8 months trying to change it anyway, because that was his job and because he was not, by nature, someone who stopped doing a thing just because it was probably not going to work. He had failed. He knew that by the time he took his seat in the human diplomatic box at the edge of the Accord's main chamber. The chamber was large in the way that things built to impress are large, designed so that anyone who entered it felt the weight of the institution bearing down from above. The ceiling was domed and very high and inlaid with the seal colors of all 6 founding races. The seating tiers rose on 3 sides in a horseshoe shape, each tier's color keyed to the species that occupied it. In the center, on the flat floor of the horseshoe, was the speaker's platform, a simple raised disc of pale stone that had been polished by 600 years of use to a mirror brightness. The observer gallery was set apart, high and to the right, with its own smaller seating block. It was where the non-member species sat, those who had been granted the right to watch proceedings, but not to vote, not to speak, not officially to exist within the chamber's process at all. Rivath was already there when Harrow arrived. He noticed her in the way you notice things that were significantly larger than everything around them. She was sitting at the front of the observer gallery, alone, no attendants, no delegation, just herself, and she was watching the chamber below with the particular quality of stillness that Harrow had begun to associate with very old things that had learned patience not as a virtue, but as a biological condition. He did not know her. He had heard of the Dragon Kingdom the way everyone had heard of the Dragon Kingdom, distantly, with respect, with the understanding that they were ancient and powerful and largely uninterested in the politics of younger species. He noticed her the way you notice something that felt like it might matter later. He did not know how right he was. The session opened at the 2nd hour, formal and precise and choreographed in the way of institutions that had been doing the same thing for a very long time. The 6 Accord representatives took their places at the central table. The secretaries confirmed attendance. Voice Warden Ulrich, who was chairing the session, announced the agenda in the flat, efficient tone of a man who had prepared this moment carefully and was not going to let anything interrupt it. The agenda was 1 item long. Ratification of the Human Containment Protocol, Accord Document 7741H. Harrow was permitted to address the chamber before the vote. This was the courtesy provision, a tradition the Accord maintained out of something between fairness and theater. Those being discussed were allowed to speak. They were not expected to change anything. The speeches were recorded for the official archive, and then the process continued as planned. He had written and rewritten his address 7 times. He had abandoned all the versions and decided, the night before, to speak plainly. He walked to the speaker's platform. He looked at the 6 faces at the central table. He looked at the tiered seating and the species arranged in their color-coded rows. He looked up once at the observer gallery and found, without knowing why he looked there, the motionless figure of Rivath watching him. Then he began. He did not open with the history of human civilization, which his first draft had done. He did not open with arguments about precedent or legal framework, which his second draft had done. He did not begin with statistics or projections or comparative analyses. He said, "We know we are not perfect." The chamber was quiet, quiet in the way it was always quiet when the person being addressed was speaking, politely attentive, waiting for the part it could discount. "We have a history we are not proud of. We have made decisions that cost us the trust of people we wanted as allies, and we understand why. We have moved fast in places where we should have moved carefully. We have built in spaces we should have asked permission to enter. We know this. He paused. But I want to tell you something about what I have seen traveling your systems for the past year. I want to tell you about a doctor who gave up her career to run a hospital ship in the outer systems because the people there needed care more than the people near the center. I want to tell you about a man who learned 7 languages in his old age because it meant he could help travelers who were lost. I want to tell you about a station crew that planted a garden in deep space, not for any practical reason, just because it made the place feel like somewhere people mattered. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not telling you these things to argue that we are good. I am telling you these things because I want you to understand what a containment protocol actually contains. It is not just our ships. It is not just our expansion. It is the impulse behind those stories, the particular human reflex that says, when someone is in need, do something. When something is broken, fix it. When someone is cold and lost, bring them in. His voice was steady. He had worked hard to keep it steady. We are not asking to be loved. We are not asking to be trusted without condition. We are asking for the chance to earn both. We are asking you to believe, based on the evidence of people doing ordinary things in hard circumstances with no audience and no reward, that we are worth the chance. He stepped back from the platform. The chamber was quiet for a moment longer than it usually was. Then the procedural machinery resumed, thanks were offered, the record was noted, and Harrow walked back to the human diplomatic box and sat down and felt the odd lightness of having said everything there was to say and not knowing what it had changed, if anything. His aide, a young woman named Dara, who had been with him for the whole 11 months, leaned over and said quietly, "That was good." "Thank you," he said. "I mean it." He nodded. He was already watching the central table where the vote was being prepared. The system was simple enough. Each representative confirmed their vote in sequence by the traditional seniority order of their admission to the accord. A majority of 5 was required for ratification. 4 had been secured in committee, which meant 1 more vote would pass the protocol. The Sarethi confirmed, in support. The Vreth confirmed, in support. The Pale Choir confirmed, in support. The Marin confirmed, in support. 1 more needed. Ulrich nodded to the Tolesi representative, who had been silent through the proceedings and who now rose from their seat with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that what they did next would be in the record for a very long time. The chamber waited. And then something happened that had not happened in the Galactic Accord's main chamber in 417 years. A figure in the observer gallery stood up. Not the Tolesi representative, they were still standing, still preparing to speak. The figure who rose was in the gallery where observers sat, where non-members watched, where voices were not permitted because the rules were very clear about who was allowed to speak on the floor of this chamber. Rivath stood. She was tall enough that standing in the gallery meant her head was near the gallery railing rather than well below it. She simply stood. She did not speak yet. She simply rose to her full height in the silence and let the chamber become aware of her. The effect was immediate. Ripples of reaction moved through the tiered seating. The Vreth representatives shifted in their places. The Pale Choir's cluster tightened. Ulrich looked up from his notes, and for the first time in the long proceedings, his composure showed something other than careful professionalism. Something crossed his face, not fear exactly, but the close cousin of it that comes when something you had assumed fixed has just moved. The Tolesi representative sat back down. Procedure said that no one in the observer gallery could speak, but procedure also said nothing about this, specifically about what to do when an elder of the Dragon Kingdom stood in the gallery in the middle of a session. Because it had not happened for 417 years, and the last time it had happened, the entire outcome of a different crisis had changed, and the records of that event had been studied and argued over by Accord historians for centuries. Ulrich said very carefully, in the precise tone of a man who was thinking as quickly as he could. The observer is reminded that this gallery does not hold the floor. Rivath looked at him. When an elder of the Dragon Kingdom looked at you, Harrow would later tell people, it was not like being looked at by anything he had a reference for. It was not threatening, exactly. It was just very complete. You felt that you had been seen thoroughly in a way that left nothing unexamined. She said one sentence. Her voice carried without effort, in the way that voices did when the person speaking them had been speaking in large spaces for a very long time and no longer needed to raise them to fill those spaces. She said, I invoke the right of remembered debt. The chamber erupted. Not loudly, the Accord's members were not given to shouting. But the eruption of sound was real, a sudden collective breaking of composure, as voices spoke at once in multiple languages, and the secretaries began consulting documents, and Ulrich's face did something that Harrow, watching from across the chamber floor, had not seen it do in 11 months of watching the man operate. It went, for just a moment, blank. Harrow looked at Dara. What is that? He said. What does that mean? Dara was already pulling information. Her hands moved over the reference system built into the diplomatic box's console. She pulled up ancient texts, cross-referenced, confirmed. Her face changed as she read. It's an old law, she said, in a voice that had lost its professional steadiness. The oldest one they have, I think. If a dragon holds an unpaid debt to people, she was reading quickly, the Dragon Kingdom is bound to stand as shield for that people until the debt is acknowledged by history. It's not just tradition. It's written into their founding texts. It's why they have a founding government at all. She looked up. And their treaty with the Accord, she checked again, there's a clause. Article 44. The Serethi wrote it themselves. It recognizes dragon cultural law in matters of honor, binding on all Accord members. Harrow looked across the chamber floor at the chaos that was not quite chaos. At Ulrich, who was consulting with his staff in the controlled, rapid manner of someone dealing with a crisis they had not prepared for. At the Tolesi representative, who had sat back down and was watching the gallery. At Rivath, who was still standing. They hold a debt, Harrow said. Apparently, Dara said. To us. To humanity, yes. Harrow thought about that for a moment. He thought about 11 months of closed doors and polite deflections and the particular exhaustion of fighting something that everyone could see coming and no one was willing to stop. He thought about who in the galaxy would stand up in the middle of a formal accord, proceeding and invoke a 400-year-old law on behalf of a species that most people in this chamber had just voted to contain. He thought about what debt a dragon elder could possibly hold to humanity. He could not even begin to imagine the shape of it yet. But he would learn. The recess that Ulrich called lasted 2 hours. That was, by Accord standards, extremely long for a procedural recess during active session. Recesses were typically 20 minutes, enough time for representatives to consult their notes or take a brief break from the sustained formality of the chamber. 2 hours meant that something had broken the usual mechanics. What had broken them was a phrase that most of the current Accord members had only ever seen in historical footnotes. The right of remembered debt. Harrow spent the recess in the small conference room assigned to the human delegation, with Dara and 2 other staff members pulling every document they could find on the subject. They spread them across the room's central table in the same way Harrow had always spread papers when he needed to understand something, edges touching, organized by date, visible all at once, so his eyes could move across them and his brain could find the shape underneath. The shape was old, older than the Accord itself. The right of remembered debt was not a law that had been invented so much as recognized. Dragon civilization had been built around memory in a way that human civilization had not. For a species that lived for centuries, memory was not an individual faculty, it was a civic one. The things that were remembered were the things that mattered, and the things that mattered were the things that were owed. A dragon elder who held a debt did not hold it in the soft, negotiable way that most debts were held. They held it the way they held everything, completely, permanently, with a precision that time did not erode. And a debt held was a debt that had to be answered. The right was the mechanism for that answer. If a dragon, any dragon, from hatchling to grand matriarch, held an acknowledged, recorded, unpaid debt to a people, the kingdom was bound by its oldest law to stand between that people and harm until the debt was resolved. Not as allies, with the flexibility and conditionality that alliance implied, as a shield, without exception. The Accord Treaty's Article 44 had been written by the Serethi delegation 400 years ago as a diplomatic courtesy, a recognition of dragon cultural law in matters of honor, intended to smooth relations between the Accord and the kingdom during a period when those relations needed smoothing. The Serethi had been meticulous about including it. They had been, at the time, quite proud of its elegance. They had never imagined a scenario in which it would bind them. Ulrich arrived at the human delegation's conference room at the end of the first hour of recess. He came alone, which was unusual. Usually a man of his seniority traveled with at least 2 advisors. He sat down across from Harrow without ceremony and looked at him directly. "You understand what has happened," Ulrich said. "I'm beginning to," Harrow said. Ulrich folded his hands on the table. "The Elder's invocation is valid. I've confirmed it with our legal team. Article 44 is not ambiguous." He paused. "The dragon holds a genuine recorded debt to humanity. It is in their hall of memory. The record is 312 years old." Harrow waited. "What I want to know," Ulrich said, "is whether you have any idea what the debt is." Harrow looked at him. "If the record is in their hall of memory, why are you asking me?" "Because the Hall of Memory is sovereign property of the Dragon Kingdom. They have shared the fact of the debt's existence. They have not shared its content. The Elder has chosen to present that content in open chamber." A pause. "I am asking you, as a matter of diplomatic courtesy, whether there is anything you know about the history between your people and the Dragon Kingdom that I should be aware of before we return to session." Harrow thought about Dara's research, spread across the table behind him. He thought about a date, 312 years ago, and a planetary designation, and a name, and a profession. He was not completely sure yet, but something in him was assembling itself toward certainty with the speed of a thing that had been ready to connect for a long time and had just found the last piece. "No," he said, which was true in the specific sense that he had no confirmed knowledge. "I'll learn what I know when the chamber does." Ulrich studied him for a moment, then he rose. "We reconvene in 1 hour." He left. Dara came and stood beside Harrow, and they both looked at the papers on the table. "Calder's Rock," Dara said. "The record we found, the entry in what we can access of the Dragon Historical Archives. 312 years ago. A human, a blacksmith." "Yes," Harrow said. "How does a blacksmith on a frontier world end up in the Dragon Kingdom's Hall of Memory?" Harrow looked at the papers for a long time. "By doing something that they thought was worth recording," he said, "something they didn't want to forget." He had no more details than that, but he thought about his address to the chamber, about the ordinary things he had described, the hospital ship, the old man with his languages, the garden in deep space, and he understood, without being able to fully explain how, that what had happened on Calder's Rock 3 centuries ago was in that same family, an ordinary act, given without audience. The kind of thing that shouldn't have mattered to the scale of history, and did anyway. The chamber reconvened. Rivath had descended from the gallery during the recess. She had been placed, with some procedural improvisation, at a secondary speaker's position, not the central disc, which was reserved for members, but a position to the side that had been used, historically, for presentations and depositions by recognized parties. The Dragon cultural law gave her the right to make her case. The Accord's own treaty obligated them to hear it. She stood at the secondary position, and she was very calm, and she let the chamber settle into its reconvened silence before she spoke. Ulrich said, with the care of someone walking ground they were not sure would hold, "The Elder has invoked Article 44 of the Accord Kingdom Treaty and claimed the right of remembered debt. The elder is recognized to present the basis of this claim. Rivath said, "Thank you." Then she told them. She did not begin with legal language or formal declaration. She began the way she had begun the same story 10,000 times in her teaching hall on Vindara, in front of young dragons who needed to understand what the oldest laws were made of. She told them about a storm. She told them about a pod that had failed in its orbit and dropped through the atmosphere of a frontier world. She told them about a hatchling, alone and injured and cold, who had been found in a crater in the snow by a human who had no reason to help her and who helped her anyway. The chamber was very quiet. She described, in the precise way of someone who had lived with the memory for 3 centuries and kept every detail sharp, the forge, the warmth, the careful hand setting a broken wing with the same skill applied to iron and steel, the mineral block placed near her mouth without knowing if she could eat it, just in case she could. 3 days of care given without question, without request for explanation, without fear. She said, "He asked me when I woke whether I was hungry. That was the first thing, not what I was, not where I was from, not whether I was dangerous. He looked at me and asked if I was hungry." She paused. I asked him why he helped me. He said, "You were cold and broken. That was enough." The chamber was still. His name was Aldrich Voss. He was a blacksmith. He lived his whole life on that planet and he died there, and he is remembered in our Hall of Memory because what he did was worth remembering. Not because it was large, because it was the truest possible version of a small thing, the thing that a good person does when they find someone who needs help, and there is no reason not to give it. She looked at the central table, at Ulrich, at the representatives of the 4 races who had voted to contain humanity. I have carried this debt for 312 years. The Dragon Kingdom has carried it with me in the record. A debt recorded is a debt acknowledged. A debt acknowledged is a debt that must be answered. Her voice was even and clear and entirely without drama. I am answering it now. Ulrich said, "The debt is to one individual. That individual is dead. The right of remembered debt applies to a people, not to individuals who have deceased." Rivath looked at him. Aldrich Voss was human. His debt is humanity's inheritance. This is not interpretation, it is the exact language of the founding text. A debt to a member of a people is a debt to that people, carried forward through their history until it is answered. You are using a 3-century-old act of private charity to block a formal accord proceeding, Ulrich said. Yes, Rivath said, that is correct. A pause. Because that is what the law says I may do. Ulrich was quiet for a moment. He was thinking, she could see it, the rapid internal recalculation of a very smart man who had prepared for a great number of scenarios, and not this one. One man, he said, you are saying that one man's act of kindness. No, Rivath said, I am saying that one man's act of kindness was where I started. Where I am now is different. She reached beneath her position's console and placed a recording drive on the surface. This is a 2-year observational record compiled by my son at my request. 427 documented incidents of humans extending help to others at cost to themselves. Species they had no alliance with. Species whose governments had actively worked against human interests. Complete strangers in need who were helped because they were in need and someone was present who could help. She looked at Ulrich steadily. I did not stand up today because of one blacksmith. I stood up because I have spent 300 years watching, and the pattern I have seen is a species that is capable of exactly what that man did, help without reason, without calculation, without limit. That is not a coincidence. That is who they are at their best. And the question this chamber is actually asking is not whether humanity poses a theoretical future risk. She paused. The question is whether a species capable of that should be put in a box by species who are afraid of them. Ulrich had no immediate answer. The thing about Rivath was that she had been building this case for 300 years. Ulrich had been building his for 40. He was very good. She was very patient, and patience over that length of time produces something that is very difficult to argue against, because it has considered every angle from every direction across more time than most careers last. The transmission came in the middle of the silence. It came from Vindara. The Grand Matriarch did not often address outside parties directly. When she did, the signal was unmistakable. It carried the authentication codes of the kingdom's highest office, and every receiving system in the chamber flagged it simultaneously. Screens activated. Ulrich's prepared next argument stopped in his throat. Sorvin's face filled the chamber's primary display. She was exactly as old as she appeared, which was very old, in the way of things that had been standing long enough that they had become landmarks. She looked at the chamber with the expression of someone who had agreed to do this thing in the time it took for her granddaughter's transmission to reach Vindara, had considered it with the full weight of 800 years of policy decisions behind her, and had decided. She said, "The Dragon Kingdom recognizes the right of remembered debt. We stand with humanity. Any vessel that moves to enforce the human containment protocol moves against us." She said it once. She did not repeat it. She did not need to. The transmission ended. The chamber broke its composure. Not into chaos. The elder races did not permit themselves chaos in formal session, but into the kind of fractured, branching multiple conversations that happened when a fixed point around which everyone had oriented themselves suddenly moved. The Tolesi representatives sat down and did not get back up. The Marin delegation turned inward and spoke to each other rapidly in low voices. The pale choir went very still, which was their species' version of crisis response. The Vreth representative began consulting their legal advisors with a speed that suggested they had identified a problem. The problem was simple. The Dragon Kingdom's fleet was the largest in this section of the galaxy. The kingdom did not use it aggressively, had not used it aggressively in 800 years, but it existed, and its size was known, and the Accord's enforcement capability was significant, but not that significant. Ulrich sat alone at the central table with the Serethi representative and looked at the document his team had spent 40 years preparing. The Tolesi withdrew. The Marin filed a recess request that everyone understood was permanent. The pale choir abstained. The Vreth quietly filed an amendment motion that effectively tabled the vote. The protocol needed 5 of 6. It had 4. 3 had just evaporated. Ulrich did not call the remaining vote. There was nothing to call. The session ended in the particular incomplete way of things that are not resolved but are finished. No formal statement, no official declaration, just the slow dissolution of a proceeding that had lost its footing and was not going to recover it today. Harrow sat in the human diplomatic box and did not move for a long time. Dara did not speak. She understood correctly that there was nothing to say yet, that what had just happened needed a few minutes of silence to be fully real. The chamber emptied gradually. Representatives filed out with their delegations. Secretaries archived. The physical space of the room reasserted itself once the people had left it, large, formal, lit from above, with the seal colors of 6 species in the dome overhead. Rivath descended from the secondary speaker's position. She moved across the chamber floor without hurry in the direction of the exit, and her path took her past the human diplomatic box. She stopped. She looked at Harrow, he looked at her. She was, he was very aware, more than 300 years old. She was one of the most powerful creatures in this part of the galaxy, attached to a kingdom whose fleet had just effectively ended a formal accord proceeding in the time it took for one transmission to arrive. She was looking at him the way he imagined she had once looked at a very small door in a very cold storm, and calculated whether the thing inside it was worth walking toward. She said, "Your ancestor kept me warm. I have wanted to say thank you for 300 years. She paused. "Please accept it now on behalf of your kind." Harrow had prepared speeches. He had prepared arguments and formal statements and 11 months of carefully worded diplomatic language for every occasion he could anticipate. He had not prepared for this. He stood up. He bowed, not a political bow, not a formal one, but the real kind, the kind that came from a different place entirely. "Thank you," he said, for he stopped because the list was too long and too tangled with things he still didn't fully understand. For everything. Rivath inclined her head. It was a very complete gesture, the kind that covered centuries of consideration and arrived at the other end as something clear and simple. Then she left. Harrow sat back down. Dara said quietly after a moment, "She came for a blacksmith." "Yes," he said. "A blacksmith on a frontier world who helped a hurt animal he didn't recognize." "Yes." A pause. "Harrow," she said, "we nearly lost everything because we didn't know to look for the right thing. And we nearly saved everything because someone did something kind to a stranger 300 years ago and someone else never forgot it." He looked at the dome overhead, at the seal colors of 6 species, at the empty speakers platform that a few hours ago had held the weight of everything he had been fighting for. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what happened." He was very tired. He was also, for the first time in 11 months, not afraid. Outside the chamber, somewhere in the corridor, he could hear the slow, measured steps of something very large moving without hurry. Going home, finally, with a debt answered. Iron remembers heat. Not in any way you could measure with instruments, not in any property that showed up in the chemistry, but every blacksmith knew it, the way a piece of metal that had been through the fire many times behaved differently from new stock, more responsive, more willing. Something in the repeated heating and working and cooling changed the iron's relationship with the process, until the metal seemed to understand what was being asked of it before the hammer fell. Aldrich Voss had known this. He had talked about it. The colonists who remembered him said, the way craftsmen talked about things they couldn't fully explain, with a quiet certainty and no expectation that everyone would follow. Metal has memory, treat it right and it remembers, treat it right enough times and it becomes something better than what it started as. He had died not knowing that the same was true of the thing he had done on a cold night 3 centuries ago. But it was. The treaty signing on Calder's Rock was set for the 42nd day after the Accord session ended. Not on a neutral station, not in the Accord's chambers, not in any official diplomatic facility. Rivath had made one request when the location was being discussed, and she had made it with the same quality of complete calm that she made all her requests, not demanding, not conditional, simply saying what she wanted with the expectation that it would be understood. She wanted it on Calder's Rock. The city had not hosted anything of this kind before. It was still, despite its growth, a working colony, practical, unglamorous, built by people more interested in function than in ceremony. But the population of 12,000 had decided, collectively, and with the particular efficiency of a community that knew how to organize when it had to, that they were going to do this right. They hung lights in the main avenue, not elaborate, the kind of lights people put up because a day matters, not because they were trying to perform mattering. They cleaned the public square near the museum. They moved the ceremonies signing table outside because the day was unusually clear, the glacier winds had dropped overnight, and the sky had gone to the pale blue that Calder's Rock managed perhaps 30 times a year, thin and cold and very high. The museum sat at one edge of the square. But on the other edge, where an empty lot had been for 30 years, there was something new. Rivath's team had been building it for 3 weeks in advance, working without announcement, working with the particular care of people who understood that some things needed to be done right rather than fast. It was a forge. Not a replica, not a monument to a forge. A working forge, coal fire, bellows, anvil, all the tools hung on their proper hooks, the whole space oriented toward function rather than display. The chimney was already blackened from the test burns they had run in the days before. The coal bin was full. The tools were clean and properly set. The sign above the door said, in plain letters, Voss Forge, in use. Rivath had been very clear about this. She had communicated it through the diplomatic channels with the kind of firm specificity that left no room for alternative interpretation. Aldrich Voss had not been a man who wanted monuments, she said. A man who charged nothing when someone genuinely needed help, and nothing was what they did not want his name on something unused and airless and designed to be looked at. If they were going to put his name on anything, it had to be something that worked. She had also sent, ahead of the signing, a gift. It arrived in a sealed container on a dragon transport ship 3 days before the ceremony. The container held a single flat piece of alloy the size of a dinner table, 1 centimeter thick, perfect silver gray in color, without a mark on its surface. It also held a sealed document of 400 pages, dense with technical information. Dara, who had become the de facto coordinator of the new diplomatic relationship in the months since the Accord session, had the alloy tested 7 times because she did not trust the first 6 results. The results were consistent. The alloy was stronger, lighter, and more heat-resistant than anything human metallurgy had produced. By a significant margin. By a margin that pushed several of the testing engineers to recheck their instruments before they would put their names on the result. The 400-page document was the formula, not just the formula, the complete methodology. Every step, explained in careful detail, translated into terminology that human engineers could apply with existing equipment. And attached to the formula, a letter from Rivath, which said, "This is what we know about making things that last. It is our gift to people who clearly know something about the same subject. Our metallurgists will come, if you want them, and show your engineers what the document says in the spaces between the words. We ask nothing in return. We give it because it is the right thing to give to people who helped when they didn't have to, and we are done watching good people do things they can't afford because they lack the materials that the Dragon Kingdom has had for centuries." Below the letter, in smaller script, was a note that was not part of the official diplomatic correspondence. It said, "He fixed my wing with 2 pieces of flat steel and cloth and copper wire. I think if he had had better materials, he would have used them. Now you do." Harrow read this note 3 times and then put it in the file he had started keeping, not an official diplomatic file, just a personal one of things from this particular period that he did not want to lose the texture of. The day of the signing was clear and cold, and impossibly ordinary in the way of days that turn out to be important. The human delegation arrived early. Admiral Sess, who had flown in from Fleet Command, stood at the edge of the square and looked at the forge with an expression that Harrow had learned, over many months, to read as the Admiral processing something she had not expected to feel. Sess was a practical woman who understood power in the language of ships and strategy and the physical geometry of military positioning. She was not, in general, susceptible to what she called unnecessary sentiment. She stood in front of Voss Forge for a long time. Harrow came and stood beside her. "The forge," she said. "Yes," he said. "They built a forge. A working one." She was quiet for a moment. "How does one person starting something like this lead to?" She gestured at the square, the lights, the treaty table being prepared, the distant shapes of dragon transport ships holding position in the atmosphere overhead. All of this. Harrow thought about everything he had learned in the past 6 months, about Rivath and the 3 centuries of vigil she had kept, about Bryn traveling through human space, watching and recording, about the 43 sessions of legal negotiation after the Accord proceeding, about the careful, thorough, painstaking construction of a formal relationship between humanity and the Dragon Kingdom from the very strange foundation that had presented itself. He thought about Aldrich Voss, who had gone back to work on an ore hauler chassis after the ship took his unexpected patient away and had never spoken of it. "I don't think one person started it," he said. "I think one person did something that started a very long chain, and then a lot of other people kept the chain going without knowing it was a chain." He paused. "And then we got lucky that someone on the other end never let go." Sess was quiet for another moment. "We should probably be decent more often," she said, "if this is what it leads to." "That's roughly my conclusion," Harrow said. The Dragon transport ships began their descent at the 11th hour, coordinated to land in the field outside the city in a formation that was precisely organized but unhurried. The Dragon Kingdom's way, always, of indicating that they were powerful and that they were also not in a rush. Rivath's ship was at the center. She emerged onto the ramp in the way she did everything, without performance, without preamble, simply appearing and then walking forward. She was accompanied by Bryn, who was shorter than her and moved with a younger creature's more visible attention to the crowd around him, and by two attendants who carried the treaty documents in sealed cases. The square was full. Every resident of the city who could get there was there, pressed back from the cleared central area, quiet in the way of people who understood that something was happening and wanted to let it happen without interrupting it. Rivath crossed the square. She stopped when she reached Voss Forge. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she put one hand, one clawed, scaled hand, against the doorframe. She held it there. Her face was still in the way of someone who has found what they were looking for after a very long search and is taking a moment to be sure it's real before they let themselves be glad. The forge was warm. They had lit the fire that morning. After a moment, she went inside. She was in there for perhaps 5 minutes. No one followed her. No one spoke. The square was very quiet. You could hear the glacier wind beginning to come back in off the high plains, distant, not yet arrived. When she came out, her face was the same as when she went in, still, composed, giving away nothing directly. But something had settled in her, visible in the way she held herself, the way you can sometimes see in very old things when they have finished something they started a long time ago. She looked at Harrow. He would have liked the anvil, she said, the original one from the museum. They used it in here, did you see? I didn't look, he said. You should, she said, it's good iron. They signed the treaty at the center table under the pale blue sky. The mutual recognition accord between humanity and the Dragon Kingdom, the first treaty humanity had signed with any elder race as equals, not as a junior member being managed. There were no performance elements, no flags, no fanfare, no ceremonial objects beyond the documents themselves. Rivath signed with the precise, deliberate strokes of someone writing something they expected to last. Harrow signed beneath her and felt, very specifically, the oddness of putting his name on something that had started with a man he would never meet. The Accord's formal reaction came 3 days later. Not opposition, the Accord had no basis to oppose a bilateral treaty between non-members, more like the careful, recalibrating silence of an institution processing a shift in the landscape. 2 more species sent diplomatic inquiries in the week after the signing. Not friendly ones, cautious ones, checking to understand what had changed. What had changed was everything, slowly. Not overnight. These things did not move overnight. But in the months that followed, specific things began to happen that had not been possible before. A human engineering team received an invitation to Vreth shipyard, the first non-Vreth personnel ever admitted to that facility. They went, and they worked beside Vreth engineers, and both sides learned things, and no one was eaten, and the resulting report from the human team described their Vreth counterparts as methodical and precise, and deeply committed to their work, which was not how the Vreth had been described in human press coverage for the past 60 years. Dragon hatchlings on Vindara began learning human languages in their standard curriculum, not as a foreign language, as an elective, as a required subject, the way the kingdom required study of all cultures that were significant to dragon history. Rivath had pushed for this. Her argument had been simple. The kingdom would be in relationship with humanity for a very long time, and young dragons should understand from the beginning what kind of relationship it was and where it came from. The story of Calder's Rock became part of that curriculum. Aldrich Voss's name, for the first time, was learned by beings other than historians, and the one elder who had carried it for 3 centuries. Human children, in turn, began to hear the name Rivath, and the older name she had learned first. Schools in the outer colonies had always taught frontier history, but now the curriculum included something new, the account of what the Dragon Kingdom had done, and why, and what it traced back to. Teachers handling this lesson reported, fairly consistently, that students responded to it in 2 distinct ways. Some found it surprising, others found it obvious. One teacher, on a frontier station that had always been poor and always been overlooked by the inner systems, recorded in her notes that a 12-year-old student had raised her hand after the lesson and said, very matter-of-factly, so being decent actually worked. The teacher had not known how to answer that. She had said, yes, after 300 years it had worked. On Calder's Rock, in the months after the signing, Voss Forge became a place where things actually got fixed. The forge master who ran it was a woman named Reth who had trained on industrial worlds and come to Calder's Rock 10 years ago, and who was practical and skilled and entirely unbothered by the significance of the space she worked in. When asked about the history, she said what all good craftspeople said about their tools, that the history was interesting, but the iron was what mattered, and the iron was good. She was right, the iron was good. Dragon metallurgists arrived 6 weeks after the signing, 2 of them, young by dragon standards, sent by Riveth's people with the technical documents and the patience to teach what the documents said in the spaces between the words. They worked in a human facility outside the city, and the first weeks were difficult in the way that any collaboration between 2 very different ways of knowing a subject was difficult, and then less difficult, and then the kind of work that both sides described carefully as interesting. The first piece of alloy made using dragon methods by human hands was, at Reth's suggestion, an anvil. She sent it to the museum. They put it next to the original. Bryn heard about this and wrote it in his personal log, which he had kept since the observational journey and had never formally filed because it contained things that were too personal for official record. He wrote, "An anvil next to an anvil. 300 years of consequence, and it comes to this. A new anvil and an old one, side by side, in a room that smells like iron." He thought his mother would like that. He was right. Riveth visited Calder's Rock one more time in the spring of the following year, the nearest thing to a spring that the planet managed, which was a brief reduction in the severity of the cold. She went to the forge in the early morning, before the city was fully awake, and she lit the fire herself, the way Aldrich had done 313 years ago. She worked the bellows. She let the heat build. She stood in the warmth, and she was very still. She did not think about the treaty, or the accord, or the years of vigil, or what had changed. She thought about a man she had known for 6 days, a lifetime ago, who had soot on his hands and cold coffee going warm on his workbench, and the simple, unhurried quality of someone who had looked at a problem and decided it was his problem now because he was there and he could help. She thought about how he had gone back to work on the hauler chassis the morning the ship came, because the work needed to be done and the colony needed it, and there was always more work to do. She thought, you never knew. You never knew when you did the right thing quietly and without announcement and went back to your ordinary work immediately after what you were starting. You couldn't know. That was not the point. The point was the doing of it, the right thing at the right moment, given freely, without counting what you'd get back. The point was that he had been warm, and she had been cold, and he had opened the door. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. She could hear it, the sounds of a working place coming to life, the far-off noise of machinery and voices, and the daily business of people who had things to do. She banked the fire down to a sustainable level, not out, just lower, the way you banked a fire that you intended to come back to. Then she went out into the morning. At the museum, in the small central room with the pale walls and the careful lighting, the 2 anvils stood side by side. Old iron and new alloy, 3 centuries between them. A small placard between them said, "These are both here because someone did a good thing when there was no reason to do it." That was enough. It always was.